Today's going to be an exciting morning because we're talking about something that you want to know about, but no one wants to hear a sermon on, okay? In my opinion, if I had come to church, if I knew up front that I was going to be teaching on this, I probably would have found a reason not to come, not going to lie. Because we're going to be talking about the sovereignty of God and the accountability of man. You know, it's interesting. We live in a world where no one really has a problem with the sovereignty of God until all of a sudden your world has turned upside down. No one has a problem with the sovereignty of God until sin has you've had this destructive encounter with sin in your life, or this devastating pain from tragedy, or someone has emotionally hurt you or physically hurt you, or the world just all of a sudden doesn't make sense. Everybody loves God's sovereignty until that moment, right? And in that moment we go, wait, God, what are you doing? You're good. You're loving. You're all-powerful. You can affect and do anything you want. I believe that. So why is this happening to me? And it's interesting because we're all strong Calvinists until pain hits our lives, and then we flip the boat, right? Well, maybe God's not as in control. You know, maybe over here we should, maybe I have more to do with this than I thought, and I need to take control over here and make this right. And so what we want to do is we want to look at this, and not necessarily the Calvinism, Arminianism argument. We're not going to look at that. But what we do want to do is we want to look at the reality of God's sovereignty, and then what are you responsible for? You're a human. You know, the Bible's very clear about heaven and hell. It's very clear about the culpability of humanity for sin. And in the midst of that, what are you accountable for with God? And so as we go through this text, we've been in chapter 9. You know, at the beginning of chapter 9, Jesus heals a man of blindness. And shows just the desire of God's heart, the importance, not only just the desire, but the importance of each of us going through healing. And not physical healing per se, but he focused this on the spiritual aspect, as we see is a massive theme throughout the book of John, that God wants to heal our hearts. He wants to heal us on the inside. He wants to make us new and change us and mold us into His image. And as you go through it, we talked about the tactics of Satan and how Satan tries to destroy that and pervert that along the way. And so as we get into this next text, we're going to see really Jesus is going to explain how God's sovereignty works, and specifically what man is culpable for. You know, when we think about sovereignty, we can go to 1,000 different verses in the Bible, or we can look at 1,000 different quotations from people. But I thought, you know what? Rather than listening to a quote from Spurgeon or C.S. Lewis, or one of the men that we all go, oh yeah, that guy, yeah, he's pretty awesome. I thought we would go to somebody who actually would know a thing or two about the sovereignty of God from the position of pain. Johnny Erickson Tata, you guys know, world-class athlete, I'm pretty sure, right? She's pretty world-class. Broke her neck, a horrible accident. She just paralyzed. This is what she says about God's sovereignty. Nothing is a surprise to God. Stop right there. Put yourself in her spot for a second. How would you feel if that happened to you? Would you feel like nothing is a surprise to God? Nothing is a surprise to God. Nothing is a setback to His plans. Nothing can thwart His purposes, and nothing is beyond His control. His sovereignty is absolute. Everything that happens is uniquely ordained by God. Sovereignty is a weighty thing to ascribe to the nature and character of God. Yet, if He were not sovereign, He would not be God. The Bible is clear that God is in control of everything that happens. Wow. You know, as you go through the book of John, we talk about the spiritual that John is trying to help us understand the importance of the Spirit, the importance of walking by the Spirit and letting God move within us. But another theme is throughout the book of John is obviously the sovereignty of God. I'm going to walk you through some texts here to kind of back this up. We're just going to stay from John chapter 3 and walk through this just real briefly. In John 3, verse 3, Jesus is speaking with Nicodemus, and he says this, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." So something has to happen within this person. You can't just earn it. You have to be born again. In John 3:8, he goes on in this process of talking to Nicodemus. He says, "The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it is going. And so is everyone who is born of the Spirit." He continues to get a little more clear as we go through this. When Jesus crosses the sea, remember he feeds the 5,000. He sends the men in Galilee, this is in chapter 6, sends the men across the sea in the boat, and Jesus walks on water, gets over to Capernaum, and as he's there, the crowd follows him. And Jesus says this about the sovereignty of God: "All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will certainly not cast out." Notice, all that the Father give to me speaks to God's hand in our salvation, God's leading, God's calling, God going before us. You keep moving. In verse 44, he says this: "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." Again, God doing this initial work of salvation, God starting this, God calling, God, I'm going to say it, choosing. Keep moving. Verse 47. This is in chapter 8, 47. Right after the Feast of Booths, Jesus has declared, "I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. I am the living water." And now he gets in here and he says, "He who is of God hears the words of God." If you're of God, you're going to hear the words of God. "For this reason, you do not hear them, because you are not of God." Again, speaking to the depth of God's sovereignty. And then when we get into chapter 9, at the very beginning, as Jesus they're coming upon this blind man, his disciples ask him this initial question: "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Remember, we talked early on a couple weeks back that the belief was that you could sin in the womb, or that all ailments and physical problems all stemmed from some form of sin. If you got a disease, it was because you sinned. If you were deformed, it was because you sinned. And so they're asking him this question, and notice the sovereignty of God in the midst of this man's blindness. And Jesus answered, "It was not this man sinned or his parents, but that the work of God might be displayed in him." So I really don't think anybody has a problem with the sovereignty of God. Where we have a problem is when all of a sudden something happens to us and we have to walk through a difficult spot in life and trust him and be in a place of pain or struggle and really have to rest that he is everything he says he is. He really is good. He really is full of grace. His love is unmeasurable, even when it feels like it's not, even when it doesn't make sense. But what happens? What are we accountable for? If God is all sovereign, what are you accountable for? In other words, if he knows everything, am I a robot? Do I just walk through this thing? And aren't I just going to kind of follow his plan and do what he wants anyway? And not only that, but if he's sovereign and he knows all things and he is in control of all things and causing all things, then what about me? How can I be culpable for something that he obviously had planned and is in control of? How can I then be culpable for that, responsible for that? And that's what we're going to look at today. I'll give you another quote. This is from John MacArthur, speaking to that effect. John says this: "We do not sin simply because Satan or because of social depravity, stressful situations, bad influences, or any other external cause." You remember the old, I forget the guy's, Wilson, he was the actor who says, "The devil made me do it." I forget, who was it? Flip Wilson. You know, you can't just blame everything on Satan or your situation or your circumstances. And I agree with him here. We can't, much, we trust in the sovereignty of God, and then we blame everything else on situation and circumstances, and we option or call audible when it's time to be culpable for what we've done. He goes on to say, those things may tempt us to sin and make sinning easier, but when we commit sin, it is because we decided to sin. Sin is an act of the will. So now we have to wrestle with this concept. If God is good and loving and kind and sovereign, then how come I'm sinful? How come I'm broken? How can I be responsible for this? So Jesus gets into this. So that's the question. If God is sovereign, what is accountability for? And so we're going to skip down. We're going to start in verse 39, and then we're going to back up to 35. So look at verse 39 of your text, if you would. Jesus says this. Now, we're just going to start here and get a baseline, and then we're going to back up. Jesus said, for judgment I came into the world. Now stop for just a second, because you'll remember earlier in chapter 5, he said, I did not come to judge. I'm sorry, in chapter 3, I did not come to judge, but to save. He's going to say the exact same thing in chapter 18. I have not come to judge, I've come to save. So we need to describe, what is Jesus saying here? It seems like, okay, what? There's a conflict here. You said you didn't come to judge, and now you're saying for judgment I've come into the world. And the judgment he's speaking of here, if we go through this text, he's speaking of the condemnation of sin. You got to remember, the cross is the perfect place for God's justice and God's love to come together to condemn sin, to say that is wrong and pay for it. Justice condemns, grace pays for. And it's this place where he is come to judge, but not in the judgment of punishment, but in the declaration of this is what is true. Sin is defeated, and I condemn it. And so it says, for judgment I have come into the world. And notice how this plays out. That those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. In other words, the cross condemns sin, but those who don't see will see. What do you mean? What do you think Jesus is talking about here? Remember, the analogy of this blind man receiving sight is this perfect picture of a person who all of a sudden is encountered by the Lord, and their spiritual eyes have been made open. We've seen this in chapter 8, where Jesus has been trying to explain and show specifically the Pharisees how blind they are. And show not only the Pharisees, but all of the Jewish nation that they're following blind guides. And so he says, I've come so that those who don't see will see. The idea of being that those who don't see are these who are spiritually unable to see, but they recognize it. There's a humility. There's an admission of need. So I want you to think about it this way. Have you ever been in a place of need, but your pride would not let you ask for help? Has that ever happened to any of you? Of course it has. It's happened to all of us. Being in a situation where you really need some help, but you're just going to kind of tell yourself you don't. You're going to tell yourself that I can do this on my own, and you're just going to push through and recreate in your own mind a positive place so that you can live without having to humble yourself, without having to express that you truly have need. And that's the idea. He's saying those who know they're needy, those who are blind, I've come so that those can be given sight. But the ones who, in their pride, are saying, I don't need help, I've got this. I'm a Pharisee. I know the law, Jesus. You can't tell me something I don't know. That person, because you think you see, you're going to be condemned in your blindness. You see how that works? And so as Jesus lays this foundation, what you find is that there is a division here, a division that Jesus causes. Those who are needy in their blindness recognize they're blind, recognize their need. And so when Christ comes, they're going to receive sight. But those who don't think they need it, they're not going to see. And it's almost like that video that that Bear put on last week of the guy putting on his glasses. Remember? I'm so awesome. I'm not going to cry. I've seen a bunch of these videos. I took 15 bullets in Vietnam, or whatever he said. He's like, I'm tough. Oh, dear God. It's like, as soon as he put on the glasses, boom, waterworks. Here he is, I don't need this. I'm just doing this for you. And once he saw, it affected him and it changed him. And I think that's what we see happening here. Jesus says there's a division. I've come. If you think you're blind, you need me, I'm there for you. You think you can see, even though you're blind, I can't help you. I can't help you. So here's what we want to do. We need to answer the question of what are we accountable for? We're going to do that by moving back up to verse 35. Remember, as we go through from verse 35 into this piece, from the verses above 35, as we move through this, you need to remember what's happened. So Jesus has healed the blind man. The blind man has been taken. He's met his neighbors, and his neighbors didn't even recognize him. Me and Josh Jones were talking about the fact that he probably had a blindness that caused physical deformity. When you don't have eyeballs, you're in your head, and you're born that way, it actually causes your ocular cavities and the bones around your face to grow differently. And so here Jesus is. This is what I think happened. He makes mud eyes, just like he did with Adam in the garden, made a mud man, breathes life into him. He makes mud eyeballs. Boop, boop. Go wash that off and let's see what happens. He was so changed, his neighbors didn't recognize what he looked like. And he comes back, and they take him to the Pharisees, and they're like, we got to show this. Pharisees say, what happened? He says, this man Jesus healed me. We don't believe you. They go get his parents, bring his parents in. His parents knew what was going on. We're scared of the Pharisees. This is our son. Don't ask us any more questions. That's what they did. They bring the son back in and they grill him. And he begins to walk them through. I just told you, why do you want to hear this? And he says this, he says, I was blind and now I see. That's a fact. He kind of uses logic to help them understand this. He says, I was blind and now I see. We have no record. We know of no one who has been blind from birth receiving sight. That's never happened. We also know that only God heals. He brings this up, this blind theologian. Only God can do this. We know that if this man was not God, this is verse 33, he couldn't do anything. So we know I was blind. We know we don't have anybody who's ever been blind from birth that's been healed. We know that only God heals. And we know that this guy, if he wasn't from God, he couldn't do this. And in verse 34, which is what we're leading into after, and we see that the Pharisees go, who do you think you are? That you try to teach us? And they kick him out. And that's where we're left. So if we're going to understand accountability, something has to happen here. And what we're first going to see is that the blind are accountable to believe. That's part of this accountability process. This man's been kicked out of the temple, and now something has to happen in his life. And notice what happens in verse 35. Look at this. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. Now, notice, remember, the blind man has never seen Jesus. He's only heard his voice. He's only felt his touch. He's never seen Jesus. So when he's kicked out of the temple, he can't just go find him. He doesn't know what he looks like. But when Jesus heard what the world had done to him, and having found him, I want you to stop right there. Jesus found him. You see that? That's a real important piece. The guy didn't have to search and search and search and search and search and search till he found Jesus. I want you to know something. You didn't have to search and search and search and search and search until you found Jesus. You didn't do that. In your sin, you would have never done that. I can say that about myself. As a broken, dumb, sinful, blind person, I would have never been able to grope around long enough until I found Jesus. He had to find me. And all of John points to that. He had to find us. So let's start right there. Jesus found him, and he said to him, this is important, do you believe in the Son of Man? There's this question. This is the question of accountability. The man is accountable, this blind man is accountable to believe. Do you believe? All of this has happened to you. You've been set free from a world of darkness physically. But guess what? You're still in spiritual darkness. I need to know, do you believe in the Son of Man? The Son of Man is a term that comes out of Daniel chapter 7 where Daniel is seeing a vision. And it's a vision that gives us a picture of the future, God's judgment, and ultimately a kingdom that is set up by God, and Christ is the reigning one who reigns in that kingdom. And it says, talking about God, and it says, the Ancient of Days was on his throne, and one like the Son of Man approached him. So you've got God on the throne in Daniel's picture, and then you've got this humanoid, this one who is obviously related. They look identical, but he looks like a human. He's a Son of Man, but he's this guy as well. And Daniel gets this vision. And so the Jews knew, if we're looking ultimately to a Son of Man, a divine human of some sorts. And so Jesus asks him this. Do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you even theologically have the depth within you to know, to look for this guy? So this man is accountable to something. He's accountable to believe. And notice what he does. Keep reading here, and starting in verse 36. And he answered him, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Do you realize what's happening? Notice, he's ready to believe. Who is he? He just needs the object. Who is he? Who is he so that I can believe in him? I've been blind since birth, mister. I haven't been able to see anything. You want me to believe in somebody? I'm ready to. You just point him out to me. I've experienced something today, bro. I don't know if you know this, but man, I used to not be able to see. And something crazy happened. So if you know where this guy is, please point him out. Show me him so that I can believe. This man is filled with faith and just needs the object to be exposed to him to believe in. So he's accountable. Jesus says, do you believe? Just like you and I. We are accountable for our faith to trust in what we've been introduced to. No one has a problem, listen, no one has a problem with the introduction of what I like to call the intersection of Christ into the life of every human being who has ever trusted in him. We don't have a problem with that. We don't have a problem with the calling of the Spirit drawing us, the work of Christ in the life of the believer beforehand. No one has a problem with that. On any argument, the Calvinists don't have a problem with that. The Arminianists don't have a problem with that. No one has a problem with that. So from a foundational perspective, we understand that Jesus has worked and come after us. But what we don't understand is this moment here. So I know I have to believe. I know I have to trust. I know I have to make a choice. And that, my friend, is where everything begins to derail. In the church world, we begin to throw up our hands and we start to divide on this issue of I have to make a choice. I have to believe. No. God does all the work. Well, yes, nobody argues with the fact that God does all the work, but we have to believe. And it's evident throughout the Scripture that you're culpable for the reality that you must trust in Him. It requires faith. You have to trust. Do you believe? Show him to me, and I'll believe. So the next thing we see is not only is he responsible or culpable for his faith, But the blind, and notice I'm calling them the blind because that's what Jesus set up. Remember, Jesus said, those who don't see will see. That's who we're talking about. The blind, those who don't see, who are in need, who recognize their need and need help, those will believe. And those blind ones are also responsible for their worship. Church, we're responsible to trust in Him, and we're responsible to worship Him. Here's what I mean by that. Let's focus on this for a second. What do you worship? You worship stuff that you cherish. You worship things that you adore. You worship stuff that you love. If you don't understand that, all you have to do is you have to begin to think about what and how you worship differently. See, we're trained to grow up especially if you've been in a Christian world very long, worship looks like coming to church and singing songs. I want to tell you that is an aspect of it, but that is far from a definition of worship. Worship is the idea that I turn my face in adoration of something, in love of something. I begin to go after something and I bow before it. This is why idolatry is a thing. It could be anything. And what you'll find is that whatever you cherish, whatever you adore, whatever you love, you're going to find that that thing is something you're worshiping. You're accountable to worship God. This is the first commandment of the 10 Commandments, right? We are accountable to Him. What was the greatest commandment of all things? Love the Lord your God. How many of us, listen, let me kick you in the stomach for just a second, okay? How many of us spend more time, again, not a bad thing, but we spend more time trying to gain more information about God instead of trying to love Him? And this is the big disconnect in the Bible church. I'm just going to throw it out there. Bible church doesn't understand how to love God, and it's evident. We don't know how to worship God. Gosh, if anybody raises, me and Lindsay were talking about this earlier. If anybody raises their hands, it's like, oh, put your hand down. What are you doing? And nobody wants to be the first, right? You're singing. You're singing and we're raising hands. Gosh, the Bible church, we're like, oh, man, don't do that. We're freaked out about emotionally trying to connect with the God of creation somehow. What is wrong with us? We focus so much on the Word and deepening our knowledge and don't realize that knowledge is a means to an end, which is love. Okay, men, women, you've been married to your husbands or wives for a long time. Hopefully you're still in love with them. It's a disclaimer. You never know. For those of you that are still in love, is your love now deeper and better than it was when you were a kid and newly married? Absolutely. There's probably few of us that are going to go, no. Some of us might. But I'll tell you this, the point of knowing someone as you get to know them more, the point is that it deepens my love. Can you imagine being married to somebody where it was just only intellectual and all I did was know them? That's not a marriage, right? We'd all attest to that. That's a business transaction. You know what I'm saying? That's like a coworker, and we just happen to be roommates somehow. You see my point? See, the point of knowledge and deepening our understanding is to lead us to a deeper, more committed, more emotionally connected, intimate love relationship. And if it happens to a spousal situation, how is it any different to the God of creation? That the more we understand, it should deepen our knowledge, deepen our love. But unfortunately, we stop here because we're scared to feel something for God. But we are accountable to worship Him. Look at this text in verse 37. Jesus said to him, remember the question, do you believe in the Son of Man? Show Him to me. I'm ready. I want to believe. And Jesus says, you have seen Him. Now stop. What a thing to say to a blind man. This guy could probably count on both hands one time how many people he's seen since he's been able to see. You know what I'm saying? You've seen him. Well, I saw Jim and I saw Bob, and those guys that ain't the Son of Man. I saw Spunky. Oh, no, he definitely ain't the Son of Man. You know, he's going through his list. You've seen him. Wait, sir, my eyes have worked all of about an hour. I've seen him? Keep reading. You've seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. And look in verse 38. This is such a huge piece. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Do you realize that this type of intimate interaction in the book of John has only happened one other time, where Jesus has physically found somebody, come up to him, had an interaction with him, and said, oh, by the way, I'm the Messiah. It was the woman at the well, Samaritan woman at the well of Jacob. Remember that? It says the same thing to her. Here he's got this guy over here, he's healed him, says the exact same thing. And his response is worship. So what happens when we encounter the person of Christ? Are we worship? Is that what we do? Is that what you do? Because we're accountable to that, I believe. Let's keep looking at our text here. So now we hit 39 again. Let's go back to 39. We read in the beginning, and Jesus has just introduced himself to this man. This man is his God. I mean, I can't imagine what he did. You're the one that healed me. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of Man. You're the one that and you cared enough to take a walk away from everybody else to come find me. You walked away from the masses to come to me. You love me that much to leave the 99 and come to the one who couldn't see and was about to be devoured, and you found me? And this is when Jesus says, for judgment, I've come into the world. I'm here to condemn sin. Let's get on a spiritual level now, bro. I'm not just here to heal you physically. I want to change your heart. I want to make it new. You're going to be a new creation because of what I'm about to do on the cross. I'm going to die for your sins. I'm going to raise from the dead. I'm going to heal you, not just here, but in here. Look what he says. Judgment, I've come into the world that those who do not see may see, and those who see they become blind. So now we have a flip this. All right, we've just seen what those who are blind do when they encounter Jesus. But what happens to those who think they see? What are they accountable for? If those who are needy are accountable to trust, who are accountable to love him, what are those who don't think they need him? What are they accountable for? Let's look. Starting in verse 40. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things, and they said, don't you know, stop real fast, don't you know, these little sneaky suckers, they sent that newly seeing blind man out, and someone goes, hey, go follow him. Let's find out what happens. We're going to get to the bottom of this. Go. Dun, 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 dun. Right? So they're standing there, acting like they're having a conversation while listening. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things, and they said to him, wait, are we also blind? In other words, hold up, dude. Did you just call us spiritually blind? Did you just say, now they get it, right? Did you just say that we're blind? You told this guy who couldn't see that you came to give him sight, but then those of us who see, we're the blind ones? And you need to understand this. Remember how I started with the Pharisees have been spiritually blind? And Jesus has been trying to expose this. I'm going to take you back just real quick. In verse 16 of this whole thing, they said, Jesus is not from God. That was from the Pharisees in verse 16. In verse 22, they had spread a rumor around that if anyone confessed that Jesus was the Christ, that they were to be put out of the synagogue. In verse 24, they explained that they said, we know that Jesus is a sinner. Remember, Jesus was healing on the Sabbath, and they said, he's a sinner. And then verse 33 through 34, remember this guy is saying, look, no one, we know that this guy must be from God because he couldn't do this unless he was from God. And they said, get out. How dare you? So unless you think these guys are just innocent and shouldn't be held accountable, at every turn, they have rejected the possibility of Jesus being who he said he was. At every turn. And so at this point, the blind, the ones who see, remember Jesus said those who see, they're going to be blind. The ones who see, they're actually accountable for their self-righteousness. They're accountable for thinking that they've got it figured out. That's what they're accountable for. Just like those who are needy and don't have it figured out, you're accountable to trust in the Lord. But those who think you do have it figured out, you're accountable to that self-righteousness. You're going to be judged someday based on what you think you know, what you think you understand better than God. That's what you're accountable to. There's one more thing. Notice what Jesus says. Not only are they accountable, the seeing are accountable for their self-righteousness, they're also accountable for their unbelief. As much as the one who is blind is accountable for his faith, the one who thinks he sees is accountable for his unbelief. In verse 41, Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. Stop for just a second. In other words, if you can't condemn a blind man for walking out into traffic and getting hit by a car. Why? He's blind. The guy driving the car should have seen him, right? He can't see the car coming. He's acting in ignorance. He doesn't see. These men are saying, wait, you're calling us blind? We see. And Jesus says, well, look, if you were acting in ignorance, then you're right. You would have no guilt. Paul talks about this in Romans. Romans chapter 5, he explains this whole entire thing. If you're acting in ignorance in this way, yeah, you can't be condemned from the law when you don't know the law. However, we go pre-law and we recognize that Adam was held accountable to his sin because of his understanding of God and creation and the world around him. So you can't just say, I'm not culpable. But he says, no, this is true. If you're acting in ignorance, then yeah, you can't be held accountable to that ignorance. If you're blind, then you got no guilt. But notice what he says, and he's speaking spiritually here. But now that you say we see, gotcha. See, you're not blind. You just said, wait, we can see. Well, if you were blind, you're right. You wouldn't have any guilt. But because you say you see, your guilt remains. Because of your self-righteousness, because of your unbelief, because of your hardness of heart, because you don't think you need me, you think you got this under control, that you can carry the weight of your own sin and beat the grave. Guess what? Your guilt remains. Man, C.I. Scofield said it this way. He said, grace is not looking for good men whom it may approve. I love that. It's not looking for grace isn't, the eye of the Lord. This is 2 Chronicles 16:9. The eyes of the Lord roaming to and fro, seeking a heart that is fully his, that he may strongly support them. You think about God looking the globe over with this calling of grace, right? Grace isn't looking for good men to approve. There's a good one. Let's go save that guy. Is that what he's doing? No! He's not looking for the good guy to save. Because the good guy doesn't need saving because he's good. Listen to what he says. For it is not grace, but mere justice to approve goodness. You see what I'm saying? You don't need grace if you're good. That's what justice is for. You can just be justified in your goodness. Now, it takes a person who realizes I'm not good. And I'm responsible for all that I've done that's not good. I need him. He says, rather, it is looking for condemned, guilty, speechless, helpless men whom it may save, sanctify, and glorify. That's what Christ did on the cross. He's not looking for good men. He's looking for men who are speechless. I have a saying, and I want all of you guys to learn it. I want it to become a benchmark motto if we can figure. Maybe we should make a t-shirt. We need a I'm sorry, this is the youth pastor in me. Everybody, we need a t-shirt that has Benchmark Bible Church. I'm just glad to be here. Because that is what a person who looks at God and looks at themselves and sees how far Christ went to save, that's what they say. I'm just happy to be here because I don't deserve a seat on this bus. So now you have a decision to make, right? Who are you? Who are you? Are you the blind guy that Christ has said, I want you to see? Are you the one who thinks you see? And yet you're still just as blind as ever. We've got to, as a church, each of us individually has to begin to ask ourselves that question. And I would guarantee, most of us in here have done that. But at some level, there has to be this place of surrender. And maybe that's not where you've been. Maybe you've been hard-hearted. Maybe you've been struggling with that. Maybe you've been wrestling with the sovereignty of God because of the pain that's in your life and don't realize, and if you played this card, I can't be accountable if God's sovereign. Well, make today a different day. Make today a different day.